Behavioural economics on a post-it number 29. In this little video, I thought I would just explain a little further the space within which a pure nudge operates in terms of the requirements. So I talked about the requirements in the previous little video, Behavioural economics on a post-it number 27. This is number 28. And I thought I'd try, as I said, I thought I'd try to illustrate that a little bit further here. Now, a few years ago, I put forward, or I proposed in some of my writings, I think, these little three-dimensional diagrams to illustrate different behavioural public policy frameworks and where policies might or do lie within those three-dimensional diagrams, right? So I'm just going to explain this little diagram to you. Ignore this in the box, in the circle here for a moment. What this diagram shows is that if you have an intervention that moves towards, on the vertical axis, it moves towards the origin, then that intervention will be more liberty preserving, right? So, and less regulatory, and it involves less sort of coercive or banning or regulatory interventions, more liberty preserving interventions. So if you remember from the previous post-it video, nudges are required to be liberty preserving. They fall in the policy framework that's defined as libertarian paternalism. People should be allowed to continue with their pre-existing behaviours if they so wish, following the introduction of a nudge intervention. So more liberty preserving as we go towards the origin on the vertical axis, less regulatory. On the horizontal axis, this indicates that an intervention will be more focusing upon internalities than on externalities. If you go away from the origin, the intervention is focusing more on externalities. So that is to say that as you go towards the origin, the intervention is more paternalistic. It is focused upon changing the behaviours of those targeted for the good of those targeted, not for the good of others, or to reduce the harms imposed upon other people by those people that you're targeting behaviour change, but you're trying to change their behaviour for their own good, right? And the diagonal axis here, that indicates that as you move towards the origin, the intervention is more informed by behavioural economics or behavioural science. If you move away from the origin, it's more informed by rational choice theory or standard economic theory. So you might have very heavy incentives far away from the origin on the diagonal axis, because very heavy financial incentives are usually tools of standard economic theory. As you go towards the origin, then the intervention is more informed by things such as present bias or probability weighting or loss aversion or the endowment effect or reciprocal motivations or whatever falls within the behavioural economic or behavioural science canon, right? So a pure nudge would cluster, or pure nudges would cluster very, very closely to the origin here. As I've said further down, a pure nudge should be informed by behavioural science, so it'd be towards the origin, should be focused upon internalities rather than externalities, so it goes towards the origin on the horizontal axis, and that it should be liberty preserving rather than strictly authoritarian or very heavily regulatory, so it goes towards the origin on the vertical axis also. So pure nudges would cluster around the origin here, right? So an example, when you put it in those terms, actually, I've said A is a pure nudge, right? When you put it in those terms, just ignore that again for a moment, I'll talk about that in a second. When you think about pure nudges, they're not that easy to think of, really, a pure nudge that meets all of those criteria. I mean, a classic one, I suppose, and going back to linking it to previous post-it videos, might be that you place, say, the classic example of a nudge that's often used in the literature. On canteen shelves, when people go for their lunch, you place apples or other healthy options in a more salient position on the canteen shelf, say at the front of the canteen shelf, than the relatively unhealthy options such as the cheesecake and the donuts, right? So the idea there would be that people could still choose the donuts if they wanted to, or the cheesecake, so it's liberty preserving. It's informed by behavioural science because it's focused upon the notion of making things more salient, then people are more likely to do those things, more present perhaps. And it's if you're arguing that you're trying to get people to eat healthier options because that's really what they want to do for themselves and that's good for themselves deliberatively, then it's focused upon internalities rather than externalities. You're not necessarily doing it to reduce the harms imposed on other people. You're doing it to improve the benefits for those targeted for behaviour change, right? So that would be, I think that would be a pure classic nudge, actually. I've just because we're going through a pandemic at the moment, I've indicated that we might have a coronavirus-related pure nudge in this space here. So, and it would be an example of priming. So you might place a big picture of the coronavirus in public toilets, right, to try to prime people. Try to force them to remember in some way, if they could possibly forget at this stage in the pandemic, that they ought to be washing their hands on a regular basis, right? Now that would be liberty preserving. They can still not wash their hands if they've a mind to do that, I suppose. It's behaviourally informed because it's linked to the notion of priming people, setting up kind of what ought to be kind of irrelevant reminders really, but they can impinge quite heavily on people's actions, priming. And it would only be internalities if you're doing this, or purely internalities if you're doing this because you're motivated to do this for those persons' own good. You're reducing the harms to those. Of course, when you're talking about interventions in response to a pandemic, it's usually, I think, very externality focused. You're trying to get people to wear masks, to wash their hands, to socially distance, to take their vaccines, to isolate themselves if they test positive, etc., because you're very much concerned about the negative effects they could have on other people if they don't do this. But let's just assume here that you're trying to encourage them to wash their hands purely for their own good. Then if you do assume that, then this little intervention here might be an example of a pure nudge also. Okay. That's behavioural economics, and I've posted I always forget, don't I? Number 28. In the next post-it video, I'm going to move on to just describing very briefly an alternative behavioural public policy framework called shove policy, which is more coercive than nudge policies.